Hello, I'm Dr. Joel Domingo with City University, and in this video, I'm going to cover chapters 4 and 5. That is, your findings, results chapter, as well as the discussion chapter. So in a 5-chapter dissertation, chapter 1 and 2 and 3, known as the proposal, you are getting all your stuff together to go to IRB, you get IRB approval, you finally collect your data or run your tests, whatever it is, whether it's a qualitative or quantitative study, and you have all this. How do you actually write chapters 4 and 5? Let's talk about how these last 3 chapters go together. If chapter 1 was the intro, 2 being the literature review, 3 is about how do you answer the research question. Remember, the research question based on the problem statement really is the heart of your study, and so 3 is the recipe, if you will, for how you're going to address that. Chapter 4 is what was the answer to the question, and chapter 5 is really about what was interesting about answering that question. How do you fill that research gap that you discussed in the literature review, and what new questions should future researchers ask? In short, Chapter 3 is the methodology and design in heavy detail. Chapter 4 is about the findings and the data analysis and describes the application of the research methods to the question. And Chapter 5 discusses the importance, the meaning, and the significance of what was found in Chapter 4. Remember, Chapter 4 is about facts. Facts, facts, facts. There was an old show that used to be on TV called Dragnet, and a famous saying or line from that show is, "Just the facts, ma'am." The fewer the facts, the stronger the opinion. You don't want to provide any opinion in Chapter 4 because you just want to report what happened. Organizationally, you be sure to include the problem statement, purpose, and research questions. You want to organize it in a way that's easy to follow for your reader. And then the nature of the methodology and design will always determine how do you present the data, whether that's a quantitative study with a lot of numbers in it, or a qualitative study with a lot of words and quotes, etc. Remember, you do not want to discuss the literature in Chapter 4. You want to save that for Chapter 5. How do you actually organize it in the order of things? Well, first of all, as with every chapter, start with an introductory paragraph. Remind the reader of the problem, the research problem, the purpose of your research questions, etc. And you may want to include a summary of any statistical characteristics of your participants, demographics, things like that. Be sure to include tables, charts, figures, quotes as needed. Remember that quantitative studies get their results. That's the raw data. Whereas qualitative studies, they draw findings, they have patterns, they have themes, etc. Regardless of the method, be sure to organize it by the findings or the results based on your methodology once again. Okay, let's start with qualitative findings. General rule of thumb is that a qualitative study ranges from about 25 to 45 pages. In a quantitative study, it's around 15 to 25, just to give you a relative example. Again, these are not hard and fast rules. The point is that findings are pretty brief in comparison to the rest of the work. In a qualitative study, the data are the words. The data is the star, so to speak, of the show. You'll discuss the interpretation of the data later on in Chapter 5, but really you just want to report what you found. You want to summarize, again, the demographics, any descriptive data. You can use a table if you like. And of course, you want to identify the data collection process and how data was kept track of, whether you have logs, research or journals, interviews, whatever, things like that. And be sure to organize those findings by themes or the research questions. Now, a word about themes. Themes don't just appear, or a researcher will not indiscriminately decide, hey, I'm going to create this theme. No. The themes are based on the data, so you cannot have themes without first analyzing the data. That's probably the most important rule in coding and analyzing qualitative data, is that you don't just come up with themes. The themes emerge from after your coding and analysis. All right? They all emerge. Summarize them, add counts, percentages in the narrative, etc. Do not identify your participants by name. Of course, that is something that you would cover in IRB, but when you're presenting the qualitative data, you want to put things like respondent 1 or one participant said, or you can use pseudonyms, whatever you want. But again, you must provide the data. So important in qualitative studies to show quotes, whether those quotes are in block format or in narrative embedded within the narrative. Again, take a look at APA on how you format those, but be sure to include quotes. The quotes are the stars of the show in Chapter 4 in a qualitative study. Now, in quantitative studies, of course, they're straightforward. They're numbers, the data, include demographics and descriptions, etc. It's relatively shorter in length, as I mentioned, than qualitative studies. But you want to present the results of any statistical tests, include any values of significance, whether that's 0.01 or 0.05. The null hypothesis, of course, is also mentioned. Once again, describe the test that you took and why. Why do you use that certain parametric test, whether it was an ANOVA or whatnot. Describe the data collection instrument. If it was an instrument that was found out there, an assessment instrument, describe it, and include any reasons why any missing data could not be collected. Analyze each research question hypothesis by themselves, and report the outcomes of hypothesis testing. Include any validity and ethical issues. Now, when talking about the actual results in statistical presentation, you want to present the results of each test in a statistical format with tables and charts using section titles related to each hypothesis. Of course, report the test value and the p-value, and so here's an example. The study of senior high school students' intentions to pursue post-secondary education used an independent samples t-test to determine the difference on intention between male and female students. See Table 2. And then you talk further about the results and you show the actual numbers of significance, etc. That's generally how you would present data in a quantitative study. With tables, use the tables to simplify text that would be dense with numbers. All right. Describe these tests that were chosen, why, give rationale for that, describe the data collection instrument, analyze each research question, but report the outcome of the hypothesis testing. So again, if you have your null hypothesis, you mention that. If you accept the alternative hypothesis, you mention that as well. Always include those research questions in Chapter 4 and what you found based on the test. Straightforward. Okay, let's go on to Chapter 5, and now that you have got a quick and general feel for what's included in Chapter 4, what's Chapter 5 about? Well, Chapter 5 is about asserting your findings, discussing the literature, summarizing the background, problem, purpose, of course, at the beginning, but think about who really cares about the results. I mean, you have this great research study done, and you've collected your data, but what does it all mean? Let me give you a basic outline. Of course, begin with an introduction, recapping the research, discussion of the findings or the results. You want to include some implications for practice, the importance for the population. It includes future research ideas and final thoughts, of course. That's your conclusion. Around 10 to 25 pages, so it's about the same length maybe as a quantitative Chapter 4, relatively short. It can be longer, but it is not as lengthy as the literature review, which typically is the longest chapter in a dissertation. But here's some tips. In Chapter 5, be sure to link your findings to the literature. Remember, in Chapter 2, you created what's known as a research gap that your study will fill. Now you're going to go back and say, now that you filled it, so what? What does it mean? How does this study answer the research questions? You might want to organize using similar section titles as Chapter 4 because think of Chapter 4 and 5 as related to each other. They're not disparate, separate, but they're connected. For each finding and result, provide a paragraph or two of discussion. So what? So what about it? So what that you found this theme? How does that theme relate to the research question? And what does it mean in answering your research question? Make a statement based on the findings, results, always linked to the literature. In Chapter 5, you're going to have a lot of citations. Not a lot of citations in Chapter 4, but Chapter 5 you will for sure. In any research study, you typically have at the end in Chapter 5, in any dissertation that is, area for future research. Future research is about possible research that can be done based on your study. So talk about that. What could future researchers do? Include areas about things that you didn't find. Maybe you want to change the population. Maybe a future researcher will do a quantitative exploration instead of what you did, which was a qualitative exploration. Uh, Include those. Discuss those recommendations for implementation and action. Uh, Include some ideas of how you would replicate it in a different context. So just think of your limitations and delimitations section and build those out, because if you look at what boundary conditions you had, maybe different boundaries might have a different research study, and that's what future researchers can focus on. All right, wrapping it up here. Here's a final tip on chapters 4 and 5. Common pitfall is that discussion in chapter 5 has nothing to do with chapter 4. No, they're actually linked. A lot of students treat them as separate, and how do you write one with the other? My tip that I tell students is you write them at the same time, because as you're writing your findings, you're thinking about the implication of those findings. So again, if you want to correspond some titles and ideas together, please do so. Make sure there's a consistent thread throughout each chapter, reminding people about the problem, the purpose, and the research questions. Dissertations are quite repetitive, and so if you find something that always repeats that, that's okay. Make sure your document, of course, is perfect. By perfect, I mean edited per APA. There's no grammar, no writing errors, etc. All right. Finally, here's a summary. Chapter 4 is factual. Chapter 5 is interpretive, the implications. But it's based on the facts that you found in Chapter 4. Organize you according to your research questions. That's a good basic framework, because your dissertation is about answering the research questions overall. Links to the research, especially Chapter 5 to Chapter 2. Chapter 5 and 2 are related somewhat because you're filling the research gap that you talked about in Chapter 2. Always provide some future direction with those ideas for future research, and then tie it all together with a strong conclusion. This is it. This is your stake in the ground, and now I'm done. All right, that's it. I hope this video has been helpful, and I look forward to being with you on your dissertation journey.